We have created our Spring Boot application and opened the application in IntelliJIDEA. But before getting into the application code, first let us understand what is Spring Boot framework at a high level. If you take a look at this diagram, here you can see various Spring portfolio projects like Spring Core, Spring AOP, DAO, MVC, Data, Spring Security, etc. Before Spring Boot is created, developers used to use various Spring portfolio projects and then build the Spring-based applications. The problem is we had to create and configure a lot of beans explicitly. For example, if someone is developing a web application, developers need to configure dispatcher servlet and various other web layer components. Similarly, when someone is using spring-data-jpa, they had to register the beans of data source, Hibernate related components, entity manager factory, things like that. So it is a very repetitive and tedious process. So the Spring Boot framework is created to simplify building Spring powered application. That means when you are building a Spring Boot application, under the hood you are using various Spring portfolio projects only. So when someone says I am building a web application or REST API using Spring Boot, that is nothing but they are using Spring MVC, and Spring Boot is making it easy to use Spring MVC. Okay, so this is what a Spring Boot is doing. But when we say Spring Boot is simplifying building Spring powered application, how exactly it is doing? So let us understand that. Spring Boot is an opinionated and convention over configuration based framework for building Spring powered application. So here two things we need to understand. What is opinionated means and what does convention over configuration means. So here let us understand what does opinionated framework means. So when we create Spring Boot application, we have selected Spring Web dependency because we are trying to build a web application. So when we select the Spring Web dependency, it added this Spring Boot Starter Web dependency. So if you take a look at what does Spring Boot Starter Web dependency pulls, here let us take a look at the dependencies here. And if you take a look at this, here we have Spring Web MVC, Spring Boot Starter Tomcat, Spring Boot Starter JSON. All these dependencies are transitively pulled when we add this Spring Boot Starter Web. Why? Because when we say we want to build a web application, Spring Boot takes an opinionated approach of, okay, you are trying to build either a web application or a REST API. And typically for building a web application based on Spring framework, we need Spring Web and Spring Web MVC dependencies. So they transitively added these two dependencies. And also you might be building REST APIs. So they have already added this Spring Boot Starter JSON, which is nothing but again pulls JSON data libraries. So here earlier before Spring Boot, we used to explicitly add all these dependencies by ourselves. Like we had to explicitly add web MVC dependency and JSON dependencies, and so like this, whatever the dependencies we have to use for building a web application, we need to explicitly add them. But Spring Boot takes an opinionated approach of, okay, when we say we want to use Spring Web dependency, it takes that opinionated approach and add all of these dependencies to our application. Not only adding just these dependencies, but also it auto configures all the required beans for a typical web application. Like I said, we need to use register, dispatcher servlet and various other Spring MVC components. So Spring Boot already configures them automatically based on some sensible defaults. But for some reason, if you want to customize that, you can do that. So that is the meaning of what is opinionated approach. Also here if you take a look at this Tomcat dependency, like when we add starter web, it also pulls in starter Tomcat also as a transitive dependency. Why? Because in most of the Spring based applications, the default servlet container that is being used is Tomcat. So they have automatically pulled these dependencies so that you have Tomcat configured automatically. You don't have to explicitly configure this. So Spring Boot team takes an opinionated approach and then configure all these things and then register the beans, necessary beans, so that you don't have to explicitly configure them for every applications again and again, which is kind of a repetitive work, right? And not only for web layer, again, when we add spring-data-jpa, under the hood it is going to use Hibernate by default, because again it's a based on the opinion that Hibernate is the most commonly used ORM implementation, and that is why it automatically register all the beans necessary for using Hibernate and with JPA. So that is how it simplifies adding the dependencies and then configuring the beans. So unless you want to deviate from the defaults, you don't have to configure anything, and most of the required beans are automatically configured. So you will be able to just get started very easily. You don't have to know a lot of under the hood stuff that is configured by Spring Boot. But of course, as you go on, you may need to explore how certain things are working behind the scenes, and then you can explore that. But getting started becomes very easy with this auto configuration mechanism. Now let us understand what does convention over configuration means. So in a typical Spring Boot application, you can see this application.properties file under src main resources folder. So if you want to configure any configuration properties in a Spring Boot application, this is where you are going to configure them. And you don't have to specify, I am going to configure the properties in application.properties. This is by convention the default one. But before Spring Boot, when we are directly using Spring Framework, it is not the case. And different teams follow different naming conventions, like some teams configure with application.properties, some configure use config.properties. So there is no standardization. And not only that, people has to explicitly configure which properties file they are using for configuration. They need to create a configuration class and then use this annotation property source and specify which file you are going to use for configuring the properties. And then you need to register this bean property source placeholder configurer. So you need to do all this to say which file you are going to use for configurations. Okay, so this is all kind of a repetitive, and there is no standardization. So different teams follow different naming conventions and they need to explicitly configure them. But with Spring Boot, that is kind of a standardized, which means you follow this naming pattern of creating under src main resources application.properties file. That is the default one. You don't need to explicitly say or configure anything to convey the same thing. That is the default convention. So that is one example. And similarly, in Spring, there is a concept called profiles, and typically used to configure different properties for different environments. For example, when you are running your application locally, you may configure the properties in application.properties, which is kind of a default properties. But if you are deploying your application in a staging environment, maybe you want to configure the values differently. For let's say you want to configure a different database properties. And similarly, if you want to deploy your application in production, you may want to configure different properties. So before Spring Boot, again, we need to find a way to configure which file needs to pick and all that. But with Spring Boot, you simply go ahead and you can create application hyphen whatever the profile name you want to use. Like for prod, let's say you can create application hyphen prod.properties. So by this, now you can configure different properties for production profile. And all you need to do is simply say enable prod profile. That's it. And Spring Boot knows that first it loads the default values from application.properties file, and then it loads properties from this application hyphen prod.properties. And if there are any overlapping, these properties will take higher precedency. Nowhere else you need to specify if you are using prod profile and read the properties from this file. This is by convention. So like this, there are many things that got simplified with this convention over configuration based approach, which means if you simply follow Spring Boot's default naming conventions, you don't have to configure many things, but you have the facility to tweak them for whatever reason. If those default conventions are not working for you, you want to customize them, there is a way. Like if you don't want to name your properties file like application.properties, instead maybe you want to use config.properties. There is a way to configure this. But I would highly recommend to stick with the default conventions unless you have a very good reason to change the defaults. Okay, so like this, Spring Boot build on top of these two very important concepts: opinionated, which simplifies auto configuration and everything, and then convention over configuration. So many things, if you simply follow the naming and default conventions of Spring Boot, you don't have to configure many things. It automatically understands the application and register beans or whatever without having to explicitly configure them. Now let us understand the application structure of a typical Spring Boot application. So when we created our Spring Boot application, we selected various dependencies. We selected Spring Web, Spring Actuator, Data-jpa, Timeleaf. So you can see there are various dependencies that are added based on the dependencies that we selected while creating this application. Though I have selected all of them, I would like to use only the necessary ones, and as we progress, let us add the necessary dependencies. So I am going to comment out all these dependencies, and also from testing. So right now we only have these dependencies. So these are the just two dependencies we have, and going forward, as and when we build new features, we are going to uncomment and then add these additional dependencies. For now, we can say we can start with starter web and starter test. These are the bare minimum things we can have to start a simple Spring Boot web application. And also, if we reload this project here, when we generated the application using all these dependencies, it might have also generated various configurations. So I'm going to comment this out. We will come back to this when we talk about test containers related local development support or testing. We will come back to it. So for now, let's not worry about this, and let's close all of them. Now let us understand a typical structure of a Spring Boot application. So we have used maven and we have configured just starter web and starter test for testing. That's it we have. Now in a typical maven application, we have src main java, and this is where you are going to put all your main source code, and src main resources. This is where you are going to put all your configurations and anything that you want to have in class path, you will put it here. And similarly, you have test source code, and similarly you can also have test resources as well. Okay, and let's not worry about the test part as of now. Let's talk about the application structure. So here, when we generated a Spring Boot application, you have this class generated with a main method. And then we have spring application.run and giving the same class name and calling this run method. And the most important thing is this annotation. This is at Spring Boot application is the one that is doing all the magic of loading Spring Boot application and starting the application with a Tomcat container. So how exactly this works? We have this main entry point class. Going forward, I am going to refer this class as the main entry point class. So this is inside this com.sivalabs.blog package. So what does this do? When we start this Spring Boot application, it is going to scan this package and all of its sub packages for any Spring configured beans and load all of them automatically. You don't have to specify. By default, this is where our main entry point class is in this package. So when we start our application, it is going to load all the Spring beans from this package and any of its sub packages. You need to really understand this part, because if you put in a different package above this, for example, you can create another package here and then maybe create a controller, and it is not going to be loaded automatically. This is one of the common mistakes newbies do. Like if they create a configuration, any controller in a different package, like some demo or whatever, inside this if you create a controller, by default that is not going to be picked up. Okay, so that is the reason you need to understand the importance of this main entry point class and how Spring components will be loaded. If you want to create any controllers or any other Spring services, repositories and everything, you should be doing that within this main package. This is called a root package of this Spring Boot application. Okay, this is very important thing to remember. So okay, we have our basic application. Now let us start this. I am going to start the application in debug mode, and ideally it should start our application using Tomcat and start the application on port 8080. Here you can see the message Tomcat started on port 8080. Okay, so again, earlier we have seen how and where we are saying we need to use Tomcat, we need to use port 8080, where exactly we are specifying. We did not specify anything explicitly, right? So this is what I meant by convention over configuration and opinionated approach. As we have already seen, when we added a starter web, it automatically pulled this Tomcat starter also, which means it is going to use Tomcat as a servlet container and start the application. And by default, the port is configured to use port 8080. You don't have to specify this, but for whatever reason you want to change that, you can specify server.port equals to, let's say, 9090. Okay, if I restart the application again, now you can see it is going to start on port 9090. So let us check the port. So here you can see the port is changed. So this is what I meant by convention over configuration. The default is configured to use 8080, and for whatever reason you want to change it, you can change the convention and follow whatever the different values that you want to provide. Okay, now let us open the application and try to access the root URL. So here if you go and access localhost 9090, you are going to get the 404 not found error, because we do not have any API endpoints implemented to handle /localhost 9090 / URL, right? So now let us create a simple REST controller and see how to handle that. So I am going to create a controller here, and then I'm going to add this add REST controller annotation, and then I'm going to give spring hello and return hello world, and I'm giving the annotation get mapping / okay. So now I have created this inside the root package. A nested package is there, demo, and inside that I have this controller. Now if I restart the application and I access the root endpoint, I should be able to see this response. So here you can see hello world. And as I mentioned, if you do not have this in the root side, in the root package, let's move it back into SivaLabs directly, not inside the blog. As I mentioned, our main entry point class is in com.sivalabs.blog, but I have a controller that is created in com.sivalabs.demo. So now if I restart the application and try to access the same endpoint, it is not going to handle that, because it does not scan the packages outside of the root package by default. But if you want to, for whatever reason you want to put some code outside of this default root package, you need to explicitly configure to scan these additional packages also. But I would highly recommend you to follow the default conventions unless you have a very strong reason to put the code in outside of the default root package. So move it inside the log. Okay, so this is how simply you can get started with a Spring Boot application. We don't have to manually download Tomcat and then build the application and then deploy some way. This is how simply you can get started with a Spring Boot application. And do not worry about these annotations for now. I am going to explain what are all these annotations and what are all the common annotations that we are going to use. I will explain them in the upcoming videos. And if you are familiar with old style Java web application development, you might know that earlier we used to build web application archive files, WAR files, and then deploy them in servlet containers like Tomcat. But now the process is reverted in the sense, instead of deploying our application into servlet containers, we are embedding the servlet container core libraries inside our application, so that you don't have to set up application server or servlet container externally. All the required libraries are already part of our application. Again, if you take a look at this web starter, here we have the starter Tomcat, and it included these Tomcat libraries. These libraries are already embedded into our application. So that is the reason you are able to simply run the application from this main method, and Spring Boot is taking care of starting the Tomcat container and then deploying our application components. So that is all working out of the box. So that is the difference, and it simplified a lot of things, like you don't have to explicitly set up the Tomcat and then build the WAR file and then copy it into some folder. So you don't have to do all that. You can just create this application, just start using it. And this is how our typical development workflow would look like you write the code and then you can restart from your IDE. But in the upcoming videos, I'm going to explain how the deployment would look like. This is fine for development, but we need to package it in some way and then deploy it somewhere, right? Be it as a jar file or as a Docker container, you need to package it. So I'm going to explain that in the upcoming videos also. So I hope this video gave you a little bit of context of what is Spring Boot and what is the importance of opinionated and convention over configuration based approach. Understanding these core fundamental concepts is very important. I hope this video is helpful, and we'll see in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.